In 1918, a performer named Harry Houdini stood before an audience and caused a 5-ton elephant to vanish. It was an illusion, but a technically sophisticated one, dependent on precise engineering, controlled sightlines, and the disciplined management of what an observer was permitted to see. Decades later, the United States military would find itself in need of exactly that expertise, not to entertain, but to survive. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces launched a coordinated aerial assault on the American naval fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The United States entered the Second World War the following day. The declaration of war was swift. Preparedness for what followed was another matter. In February of 1942, approximately 8 weeks after Pearl Harbor, a Japanese submarine surfaced in the waters off the California coastline and opened fire on an oil facility near Santa Barbara. The shelling caused limited physical damage. The psychological impact on the American public and on military planners was considerably more significant. The attack confirmed what strategists had already begun to fear. The American Pacific coast was not beyond the reach of Japanese military operations, and along that coastline sat some of the most strategically critical industrial infrastructure in the country. Chief among the vulnerabilities was Boeing's Plant 2, located in Seattle, Washington. The facility covered approximately 1 million square feet. It employed more than 30,000 workers. Each month, those workers produced over 300 B-17 bombers, the aircraft that would become the backbone of American strategic bombing operations in Europe and the Pacific. If Japanese bombers reached Seattle and found Plant 2, the consequences for the American war effort would be severe. Military planners understood this. The question was what to do about it. The answer came from an unlikely combination of professional backgrounds. Colonel Elbridge Rand Culver, an Army engineer with formal expertise in camouflage and an amateur's passion for stage magic, was assigned to solve the problem. His solution was not conventional. Culver proposed building a complete fictional neighborhood directly on top of the factory. The concept required more than military engineering. It required the kind of expertise that Hollywood had spent decades developing. The ability to construct environments that appeared entirely convincing from a specific vantage point while being entirely artificial in their construction. Culver recruited John Stewart Detley, an Academy Award-nominated art director whose credits included some of the most technically demanding productions of the era. Detley, working from Seattle, assembled a team that reflected the scale of the undertaking. 13 architects, 8 commercial artists, 7 landscape architects, 5 engineers, and a soil management specialist. Construction began with the installation of 26 acres of netting stretched across the roof of the plant, suspended approximately 50 feet above the building's surface. This created a continuous, elevated platform, a blank canvas on which an entire residential environment would be built. The team designed and constructed 53 houses, 12 garages, multiple greenhouses, a service station, and a corner store. Because aerial observation makes it effectively impossible to judge the true height of a structure from directly above, the buildings were constructed at roughly 1/3 of standard scale. Plywood and canvas frameworks that presented a convincing silhouette from altitude without the weight or material cost of full-scale construction. The landscaping received equivalent attention. Trees were fabricated from fiberglass armatures with foliage constructed from chicken feathers, painted in appropriate seasonal greens. Footpaths wound between the structures. The neighborhood had texture, variety, and the visual complexity of a place that had developed organically over time. To complete the illusion, Boeing employees were invited to spend their breaks on the rooftop, moving cars, hanging laundry, and occupying the fake porches in the manner of ordinary residents going about an ordinary afternoon. The goal was movement, the small and irregular animations that distinguish a living community from a static model. The total cost of the installation reached $3 million, approximately 10 times the budget of a major Hollywood production at the time. By spring of 1943, the project was complete. Military officials in Washington dispatched aircraft equipped with cameras to conduct the kind of aerial reconnaissance a Japanese bomber crew might perform. The photographs that came back were unambiguous. Plant 2 had disappeared. In its place was a quiet residential suburb, indistinguishable from the surrounding Seattle landscape. The installation remained in place and remained secret until the final weeks of the war in the Pacific. On July 23, 1945, 3 weeks before Japan's formal surrender, the Seattle Daily Times published the story for the first time. The headline they chose for this neighborhood that had never existed, home to no one, built on the roof of the factory that built the bombers, was the Boeing Wonderland. The camouflage of Boeing's Plant 2 had been a feat of physical construction, a visible object rendered invisible through the careful manipulation of what observers could see from a distance. A decade later, the United States government would require a different kind of deception. Not the concealment of a place, but the concealment of an operation. One conducted across thousands of miles of hostile airspace in the middle of a war that officially America was not fighting. By 1954, French military forces in Indochina, the colony encompassing present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, were in a deteriorating position. A decade of armed conflict against Viet Minh forces had ground down French resources and resolve. The strategic situation came to a head at Dien Bien Phu, a fortified valley in the mountainous northwest of Vietnam, where more than 10,000 French troops had been encircled by Viet Minh forces under General Vo Nguyen Giap. Cut off and under sustained assault, the French garrison required resupply by air. The French military lacked the airlift capacity to sustain the operation. Facing the potential collapse of one of its most significant European allies in the region, France made a direct appeal to Washington. President Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a calculation with no straightforward solution. The fall of French Indochina to communist forces would, in the strategic framework of the period, represent a significant setback in the broader contest against Soviet and Chinese influence in Asia. But the American public, barely recovered from the Korean War, had no appetite for another military commitment on the Asian continent. Eisenhower needed a way to provide meaningful assistance without visible American involvement. The instrument that presented itself had been operating in the region for nearly a decade. Civil Air Transport, known as CAT, had been established in 1946 by American combat veterans who had flown during the Second World War. Its founding mission was the supply of nationalist Chinese forces during the Chinese Civil War. Weapons, personnel, livestock, medical supplies, CAT's pilots flew whatever was required, along whatever routes were demanded, in conditions that more cautious operators would have declined. That reputation attracted attention. By the late 1940s, the Central Intelligence Agency had begun contracting CAT for logistical support on covert operations across Asia. In 1950, the agency went further. Using a front company called the Airedale Corporation, the CIA purchased Civil Air Transport outright. The acquisition created an instrument of considerable utility. CAT maintained its commercial operations, flying paying passengers on scheduled routes across Asia, accumulating the normal trappings of a legitimate regional carrier. By the early 1950s, it had grown into the second largest air transport company in the region. Its aircraft moved through civilian airspace without attracting attention. Its pilots held civilian credentials. Its operations appeared, to any external examination, entirely unremarkable. Beneath that surface, it was an asset of American intelligence. When Eisenhower authorized covert assistance to the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu, CAT was the mechanism chosen to deliver it. The operation required a level of concealment that went beyond simply using civilian aircraft. American involvement had to be completely undetectable. Every visible element of the mission had to suggest French military activity. Overnight, a fleet of CAT's transport aircraft was repainted in French military colors. Identifying markings were altered. Radio communications were conducted in French. The pilots themselves, Americans flying on behalf of an American intelligence agency, on a mission authorized by an American president, dressed and operated as French airmen. Beginning in March of 1954, the disguised CAT crews began flying supply missions into Dien Bien Phu. The missions were conducted under sustained anti-aircraft fire. Veterans of the operation later compared the intensity of the ground fire to the worst conditions they had encountered during the Second World War. 2 CAT pilots were killed in the course of the operation. Over 2 months, CAT crews flew nearly 700 missions into the besieged valley. It was not enough. In May of 1954, after 55 days of siege, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu surrendered. It was the decisive engagement of the First Indochina War. Within months, France had agreed to withdraw from Indochina entirely. For civil air transport, and for the CIA's investment in covert air operations, Dien Bien Phu was a setback, not a conclusion. As French colonial authority in Indochina gave way to the partition of Vietnam and the slow escalation of American involvement in the region, the infrastructure of covert air power continued to develop. In the late 1950s, civil air transport was reorganized and rebranded. It became Air America. Under that name, it would fly thousands of missions across Southeast Asia over the following 2 decades, supplying Allied forces, extracting personnel, and supporting operations across Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam that the United States government was not officially conducting. Air America continued operating until 1975, when the fall of Saigon brought the American involvement in Vietnam to its end. The airline's doors closed. Its aircraft were dispersed. Its records were classified. The most successful covert airline in history quietly ceased to exist, as invisibly as it had operated. The camouflage of Boeing's Plant 2 and the covert operations of civil air transport were separated by a decade and conducted under entirely different circumstances. One was a feat of physical construction. The other was an exercise in institutional identity. But both rested on the same foundational principle, that what an observer believes they are seeing can be precisely managed through the careful construction of an alternative reality, maintained with sufficient discipline and detail to withstand scrutiny. In wartime, that principle is called strategic deception. In peacetime, it passes by other names. What remains consistent across both episodes is the scale of what can be hidden and how long it can stay that way.